Mist hangs low over the Blue Ridge Mountains, curling around the crooked trees like pale fingers reaching for anything warm that dares to breathe. People say these mountains hold history, but out here, history feels less like a memory and more like something alive, something that watches. I first heard about the Kellam women in a roadside diner, where the locals spoke with the kind of caution you use when discussing something cursed. They said a mother and her daughter shared the same husband. Not because they wanted to, not because it was some outlandish rumor, but because that's simply how things had always been in that isolated corner of Virginia, far from outsiders, far from laws, and far from the light of reason. Most folks lowered their voices when they mentioned the family, as if the hills themselves were listening. One old man told me they were a leftover from another time, a time when bloodlines mattered more than humanity, and he begged me not to go near their land. But curiosity is a dangerous sort of hunger. The first time I saw the Kellam property, it didn't look like a home, it looked like a warning. A collapsed barn leaned toward the earth as if trying to hide, while a rusted swing creaked even without wind. The daughter stepped out onto the porch when she noticed me, her expression soft but hollow, like someone who'd long forgotten what freedom felt like. Her mother appeared behind her, tall and stern, resting a hand on the younger woman's shoulder with a grip that looked too tight to be comforting. When their husband finally emerged, he didn't speak at all. His eyes darted from one woman to the other before settling on the ground, as though the weight of choosing where to look could break him. Something in their silence felt wrong, deeply wrong, like there was a script they all followed and none of them dared to deviate from. As evening settled, the forest grew impossibly quiet, and a coldness crept across the property that didn't match the season. I heard whispers, not from the family, but from the woods, as if the trees were repeating a story they'd tried to forget. I should have left then, but something kept me rooted in place. Maybe it was the daughter's fleeting glance, filled with a fear that carried its own kind of plea. Maybe it was the mother's unblinking stare, challenging me to turn away before I uncovered something meant to stay buried. Or maybe it was simply the mountains themselves, holding me fast, refusing to release me until I learned the truth of what really bound that family together. Whatever it was, I didn't run. And that was my first mistake. The reclusive mountain community of Virginia had always been spoken about in half-whispers, as though everyone who mentioned it feared the land itself might be listening. Tucked deep between the folds of the Blue Ridge, it was a place the modern world had forgotten long before the rest of the country learned it even existed. Roads leading into it were little more than old logging paths tangled with tree roots, and the few houses scattered across the hillsides looked as if they were stitched together with whatever scraps their owners could salvage. What made the area so unsettling wasn't its isolation alone, but the way people behaved whenever the topic came up. Locals in nearby towns treated the mountain community as if it were cursed soil, something left over from an older, darker chapter of American history. Questions about the families living there were met with evasive glances or sudden changes of subject, and even the boldest storytellers lowered their voices when referring to the Kellams, the family at the center of every rumor. It was said that the mother and her daughter shared one husband, though no one could confirm where the story started or who first brought it down from the hills. The unsettling part wasn't the rumor itself, but the way people reacted to it. Instead of dismissing it as mountain gossip, they reacted with a tense discomfort, as if they were afraid someone might overhear and report their curiosity. The mountain folks did not tolerate outsiders, that much was clear, and those who ventured too far up into the hollows rarely returned with the same ease as they left. Some came back pale and tight-lipped, refusing to talk about what they saw. Others simply never returned at all. When people spoke of the Kellam family, they always mentioned the same strange details, the way the mother kept everyone else away, the daughter who almost never left the property, and the man who seemed to exist only in the background like a shadow belonging to both women. Those who had glimpsed the family from afar claimed something about them felt off, something beyond simple isolation or unusual marriage customs, something that lingered in the air around their land like moisture that refused to evaporate. As the rumor spread, so did a quiet unease about what else might be happening in those mountains. The land had its own language, creaking trees, sudden silences, and a feeling of being observed, and people believed the Kellams understood that language better than anyone else up there. The story of the shared husband became less of a rumor and more of a warning, a symbol of the strange bonds and old traditions that survived in a place untouched by time. Outsiders were advised to keep away not just because the community was private, but because the mountains themselves seemed to guard the family, swallowing any truth that tried to escape their depths. The traveler who arrived in the region wasn't looking for trouble, he was searching for stories, the kind that slip through cracks in history and cling to forgotten places. He had spent years collecting accounts of isolated communities, unusual customs, and the eerie lore that grows in places where modernity never quite reaches. When he first heard the rumors about the Kellum family and the strange arrangement between the mother, the daughter, and their shared husband, he didn't believe it so much as he felt compelled by it. Stories like that didn't come from nothing. They came from pain, secrecy, and generations of silence, and those were the kinds of stories he was drawn to, the ones wrapped in layers of fear and avoidance. He entered the mountains without the cautious reverence the locals possessed, stepping onto forgotten paths with a notebook in his pocket and curiosity heavier than caution in his mind. Every person he spoke to along the way reacted to his interest the same way, first with disbelief that anyone would willingly look into the Kellum family, then with a nervous insistence that he turn back before he crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. But he kept going. Something about the way people spoke, like they were recalling a nightmare they never wanted to relive, made him believe there was more than rumor buried in these hills. His research had taught him that old communities often hid their truths in plain sight, disguised as folklore or dismissed as madness, but always grounded in something real. The air grew colder the deeper he walked into the mountains, and the landscape felt heavier, as though the woods themselves were studying him. He noticed how the trees seemed older here, how vines curled around trunks like veins, how every sound seemed only half a sound, the rest swallowed by the dense quiet. It was a place where secrets didn't just exist, they grew roots. The traveler felt the first stirrings of unease when he stopped at a small general store on the outskirts of the mountain community. The moment he mentioned the Kellum name, the room stiffened. The storekeeper, an elderly man with clouded eyes, told him that curiosity had ruined better men. A younger woman whispered that the Kellums didn't take kindly to being watched, and that their land wasn't safe for strangers after sundown. Their warnings weren't loud or dramatic, they were soft, heavy, desperate, as if they feared that speaking too strongly might summon the very people they were warning him about. Yet every attempt to deter him only pushed him further toward the truth. He wasn't looking for danger, but he was looking for answers, and the mountains had a way of making every answer feel just close enough to touch if he was willing to keep walking. The warnings began long before the traveler ever set foot near the Kellum property, woven into conversations that felt more like confessions than casual advice. Every local he encountered had their own version of the same message, though each delivered it with a tension that suggested they were speaking against their better judgment. Some shook their heads firmly the moment he mentioned the family, insisting the mountains had places where outsiders simply weren't meant to wander. Others leaned in close, lowering their voices as if the trees outside the windows had ears, urging him to leave the hills before dusk settled. What unsettled him most wasn't the content of their warnings but the emotion behind them. These people weren't superstitious storytellers trying to frighten a visitor, they were terrified. Their eyes lingered too long on the door, on the forest line beyond it, as though expecting someone to step out of the shadows and listen. He heard the Kellum name spoken as if it were a fragile thing, something that cracked the air whenever it passed someone's lips. A young man working at a repair shop told him that anyone who got too close to their land ended up regretting it, though he refused to explain further. An older woman, her hands trembling as she stacked canned goods, said the family didn't like being observed, and those who tried seldom tried twice. Even the sheriff, a man who looked too worn out to be afraid of anything, advised him to steer clear of that patch of mountains. He spoke slowly, choosing his words with care, explaining that the Kellums kept to themselves and expected everyone else to do the same. When the traveler pressed for details, the sheriff's gaze hardened, and he simply walked away. Every warning seemed to grow heavier, as though the further he pushed, the more the locals feared for him rather than themselves. They spoke of the Kellum property as a boundary, a line between the world they understood and something older and darker that lived deeper in the hills. A place where people disappeared, where women rarely smiled, and where a man's role in the family felt more like imprisonment than partnership. Yet no one ever mentioned the shared husband directly. That part of the rumor hung in the air like a shadow, understood but unnamed, as if saying it aloud would give it strength. The traveler could feel the weight of their dread pressing against him, urging him to turn back. But human fear, when it becomes collective, often signals that a truth lies beneath it, something raw, something dangerous, something worth uncovering. And with each warning, the Kellam land only drew him in further, like a whispered invitation he knew he should ignore but couldn't. He met the daughter before he ever saw the house clearly, as though she had been waiting for him without wanting to be seen. She emerged from the blur of the tree line with slow, careful steps, her posture tense like someone who had learned long ago to move quietly. At first glance she didn't look dangerous or strange, just tired in a way that didn't belong to someone her age. Her hair hung loosely over her shoulders, tangled as if brushed only by the wind, and her clothes were simple, worn, and a size too big, as though she'd outgrown them but had no replacements. What struck him most was her expression, a fragile mix of fear and curiosity, like she was torn between wanting to speak and wanting to vanish back into the woods. Her eyes carried a depth he recognized immediately, the kind that comes only from years spent hiding things that should never have been hidden. They were wide and glassy, reflecting both a silent plea and a warning she couldn't bring herself to voice. When she noticed him watching her, she froze. Not with the surprise of someone caught off guard, but with the dread of someone who had been trained never to approach strangers. Her breathing quickened in a way that made him wonder how many times she'd been punished simply for making a choice on her own. She didn't step closer, but she didn't run either, and that hesitation told him more about her life than any words could. People who were free either engaged or left. People who were controlled did neither. The longer he looked at her, the more he sensed that she was trapped in some invisible cage, one built not with metal, but with rules, expectations, and fear. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible, as if she feared the sound itself might betray her. She didn't ask who he was or why he was there. Instead, she asked whether he'd gotten lost, as though the possibility of someone coming intentionally to their land was unthinkable. He tried to reassure her, but she flinched at his tone, glancing over her shoulder as though someone might be watching. That moment revealed a truth he hadn't expected: she was not alone in her fear. Whoever controlled this land controlled her completely. The traveler noticed how she trembled, not dramatically but constantly, like someone who lived in a state of quiet panic. She glanced toward the house with a terrified urgency, urging him to leave even without saying the words outright. He realized then that her fear wasn't of him, but of who might see her speaking to him. It was fear carved into her bones, a fear that had been fed to her over many years. And yet, behind that fear, flickered something else, a desperate hope that he might be someone who could finally understand what she'd never been allowed to say. When he met the mother, the difference between her and her daughter was immediately clear. Where the daughter seemed fragile and haunted, the mother radiated a quiet, almost suffocating authority that felt as old as the mountains themselves. She moved with a slow precision, each gesture deliberate, each glance calculated, and the traveler could sense an unspoken power in the way she commanded the air around her. The first thing he noticed was her eyes, sharp, assessing, and unyielding, the kind that could measure a person in a single second and decide whether they were welcome or dangerous. She didn't smile, not even politely, and when she spoke, her words carried the weight of someone who had long ago decided that her opinions were the only ones that mattered. Her voice was low, steady, and measured, and it somehow made him feel both observed and exposed, as if every thought he had was suddenly legible to her. Her presence changed the atmosphere of the property. Even the daughter, who had seemed almost frozen with fear before, shifted under her gaze, standing straighter but with tension that suggested submission rather than comfort. The mother's control was subtle yet pervasive. She didn't need to raise her voice to assert dominance, because her mere presence did the work. It was clear to the traveler that the relationship between mother and daughter was not one of simple kinship, but of carefully maintained authority and possession. The daughter moved and spoke almost as an extension of her mother's will, a living reflection of rules enforced through years of expectation and fear. There was no warmth between them, not the kind that should exist between parent and child, only an almost ritualized connection that left the traveler unsettled in ways he couldn't immediately articulate. He realized quickly that the mother's hold extended beyond her daughter. Even the husband, when he appeared, seemed to shrink in her presence, avoiding her eyes, answering questions with the kind of hesitation that suggested he was constantly measuring what could be said safely. The mother had created a small, self-contained world where she dictated the rules of interaction, emotion, and even loyalty, and everyone inside it knew the consequences of disobedience. Her possessiveness wasn't loud or dramatic, but it was absolute. It was the invisible hand controlling every thought, every word, every hesitation. The traveler felt the weight of it immediately, the way the air seemed to tighten around her. Being in her presence was like stepping into a room where the rules of reality had been rewritten to accommodate one person's will. Even without knowing the full story, he understood that she had spent decades ensuring that nothing and no one could challenge her authority, shaping her daughter, her husband, and the very land itself to serve her quiet, omnipresent dominance. When the husband finally appeared, the traveler realized just how complete the mother's control truly was. He was a man shaped by fear, habit, and an invisible set of rules that dictated every aspect of his life. From the moment he stepped into view, it was clear he moved not with the freedom of choice but with the weight of expectation pressing down on him. His eyes rarely lifted beyond the floor, and when they did, they darted quickly between his wife and daughter as if seeking permission or measuring risk. His face was drawn, hollow in ways that suggested years of suppressed emotion, and his voice, when he finally spoke, was soft, hesitant, and rehearsed. Every word seemed chosen to avoid displeasing the mother, as though saying the wrong thing could shatter the fragile equilibrium that held the household together. It was less a conversation and more a performance, a careful dance choreographed by someone else's will. The traveler noted the subtle ways the husband's body betrayed him. His shoulders slumped, his hands fidgeted with invisible objects, and even his footsteps seemed reluctant, as though the ground itself might judge him. He would glance at his daughter, perhaps seeking some small connection, but the daughter's eyes flicked away, obedient and distant, reflecting the invisible chains that bound them all. There was a tension between them that went beyond ordinary family strain, a tension rooted in the unspoken rules of their existence, where affection was carefully measured and desire carefully suppressed. The husband's gaze never lingered, never strayed beyond the narrow confines the mother allowed, and in that, the traveler saw the full extent of her power. She had shaped not just the household, but the very inner life of the man who was supposed to be the center of it. Even the smallest interactions spoke volumes. When the mother issued a wordless command, he obeyed without hesitation. When she looked his way with that piercing, unyielding stare, he flinched ever so slightly, as though bracing for punishment that rarely needed to be spoken. The traveler realized that what held the household together wasn't love, or even habit, but a constant, quiet fear that shaped every movement, every thought, every heartbeat. The man existed in a state of perpetual submission, his identity overshadowed by the will of the woman who controlled him. Observing him, the traveler felt a growing unease that went beyond sympathy. This wasn't just an arranged life or a strange custom, it was a meticulously constructed system of psychological domination, where even the one who appeared central, the husband, was effectively imprisoned within invisible walls. Walls built by someone who had mastered the art of control over not just actions, but the very essence of a person's being. And as he watched, the traveler understood that any attempt to pry deeper into the family's secrets would be walking into a world where normal rules of human interaction no longer applied, where freedom had been quietly extinguished long before his arrival. As night fell over the mountains, the traveler felt the landscape shift, as though the very forest around him had grown thicker and more watchful. The air, which had been cool and still during the day, now carried an almost tangible tension, pressing against him with a weight that made each breath feel heavier. From the edges of the property, he began to hear faint noises, whispers, rustlings, and low, unidentifiable sounds that seemed to come from every direction at once. At first, he tried to dismiss them as the ordinary creaks and sighs of the woods, the natural symphony of nocturnal life. But the more he listened, the more he realized these were not natural sounds. They had a rhythm and purpose, an almost sentient quality, like voices murmuring secrets too dangerous to speak aloud. They seemed to echo around the hills, brushing against the sides of the traveler's mind, suggesting that something or someone was aware of his presence. The family itself seemed unchanged by the sounds, moving inside the house with practiced ease as if the whispers were part of the routine. Yet for the traveler, each creak of a branch or soft rustle in the brush became amplified in his imagination, magnifying the sense of being watched. The daughter's occasional glances toward the forest hinted that she, too, was attuned to these noises, though she betrayed nothing beyond a faint tightening of her shoulders. The mother, in contrast, remained composed, a steadying force that seemed to ignore the forest altogether, as though her authority extended even to the unseen entities lurking beyond the yard. The husband, however, shifted uneasily with every unusual sound, his hands twitching slightly, his eyes flicking toward the darkness as if expecting something to emerge. It was as though the forest itself participated in the same system of control that bound the family, a silent, ever-present witness to their lives, their secrets, and their fear. The whispers grew more insistent as darkness deepened, sometimes so subtle that the traveler questioned whether he was imagining them. Yet even the faintest echo carried with it the sensation of being observed, of someone or something tracking his movements, judging his presence. It was not malevolent in a straightforward way, but it was relentless, patient, and unyielding, a quiet pressure that amplified the isolation of the property. He realized that the mountains themselves, their trees, and the shadows between them were not neutral. They were part of the same ecosystem of control, the same web of tension that held the family together. Here, the wilderness was not just a backdrop but an active participant, a living extension of the fears and boundaries that had defined the Kellam household for decades, and he could feel, with every snap of a twig or shiver of wind, that stepping even slightly beyond the invisible line would have consequences he could not predict. The traveler's curiosity eventually led him inside the house, though not without the lingering sense that he was crossing into a space meant to remain secret. The air within was heavy and stale, carrying the faint scent of wood smoke, damp earth, and something else he couldn't name, something older and more unsettling. Dust lay thick on surfaces, and the furniture, though simple, seemed carefully arranged to maintain strict order rather than comfort. On a small, scarred table in the corner, he noticed a stack of old journals and letters tied with fraying twine. They were yellowed with age, their edges brittle, and the handwriting within was cramped and deliberate, sometimes spiking with jagged scrawls that betrayed sudden bursts of emotion. As he gingerly opened the first journal, he realized that these documents contained the untold history of the family, a chronicle that stretched far beyond what he had glimpsed from outside or heard from the locals. The letters revealed patterns of control, manipulation, and long-buried secrets, a web that connected mother, daughter, and husband in ways that were both intimate and horrifying. Some entries were penned in the mother's meticulous hand, detailing strict rules and expectations, punishments meted out for any sign of disobedience, and the careful orchestration of interactions to ensure that no one challenged her authority. Others, presumably written by the daughter, carried the weight of quiet desperation, fear tempered with longing, obedience mingled with fleeting glimpses of resistance, and confessions of emotions never spoken aloud. A few pages, written in the husband's hand, were almost entirely blank except for short, fractured sentences, as though the act of writing itself had been suppressed over time, leaving only traces of thoughts too dangerous or forbidden to fully express. Through these documents, the traveler could see the invisible threads that tied each person to the other, threads of obligation, fear, and expectation that had been woven over decades. What unsettled him most, however, were the details of the family's past, passed down not just through words but through patterns of behavior and ritual. The journals hinted at generations of marriages arranged in ways that prioritized lineage over love, obedience over consent, and secrecy over transparency. There were descriptions of subtle punishments and rituals designed to instill control, references to outsiders who had come too close and subsequently vanished or left the community forever changed, and occasional entries that hinted at an almost ritualistic reverence for the land itself, as if the mountains had been enlisted in the family's system of domination. Reading these pages, the traveler began to understand that what he had taken for rumor or legend was, in fact, the living legacy of a household that had perfected the art of shaping human behavior in the shadows, maintaining power over hearts and minds in a way that was almost imperceptible yet utterly complete. The weight of it pressed on him, a chilling confirmation that the story he had come to witness was far darker and more intricate than anything he could have imagined. Night had deepened when the traveler realized he was no longer entirely alone, though the forest and the house had seemed silent just moments before. From the edge of his vision, movement flickered, shadows stretching unnaturally long, bending in ways that didn't belong to the shapes of trees or the uneven terrain. At first, he thought it might be an animal, a deer or fox cautiously approaching, but the shapes resolved into human forms, the mother and daughter, standing together just beyond the thin line of moonlight. They didn't call out, they didn't wave or gesture, yet their presence was magnetic and disquieting. Their eyes, glinting in the darkness, seemed fixed not on the surroundings, but directly on him. The air between them and the traveler carried a tension that was almost physical, a quiet insistence that he take notice of what he had come to witness. There was no welcome in their stance, nor an invitation in the traditional sense. It was something more complex, a blend of warning and revelation, an unspoken command to understand the rules he had stumbled into. He froze, heart hammering, unsure if movement might break some fragile boundary. The mother's posture was rigid, her shoulders squared in a way that conveyed silent authority even in shadow. The daughter mirrored her, smaller and taut with fear, yet their synchrony suggested something older and deeper than mere obedience. For a moment, he felt as though time itself had slowed, stretching each heartbeat into an eternity. It became apparent that this was not a casual appearance. They had intentionally emerged to make themselves seen, and yet they had not approached the house or spoken a single word. It was as if their very presence was a message, a carefully orchestrated signal that carried layers of meaning he could not yet decode. The traveler's mind raced with possibilities. Was this an invitation, a test, or a warning? The way they remained still, silent, watching him with unwavering focus, suggested they were aware of everything he had witnessed and perhaps more. It was impossible to tell what might happen next, what might be permitted or forbidden if he stepped too close, or if he moved too abruptly. A chill slid down his spine, and he became intensely aware of every sound, the faint rustle of leaves, the creak of a distant branch, the quiet rhythm of his own breath. The boundary between observer and participant had vanished, replaced by a tense, fragile space in which the traveler could feel the weight of unspoken rules pressing down, shaping not just what he saw, but how he thought and even how he existed in that moment. He realized, in that instant, that the family's control was not limited to the walls of the house. Their reach extended outward into the night, into the very darkness that surrounded him. The mountains themselves seemed complicit, amplifying the sense of surveillance, of inevitability. Standing there, staring at the mother and daughter, he understood that he was not merely witnessing a strange domestic arrangement. He had stepped into a living system of control and fear, one that extended far beyond what he could have imagined and that would not release him lightly from its scrutiny. The truth that finally surfaced was far more unsettling than any rumor or whispered warning could have prepared him for. The traveler began to understand that the mother and daughter's relationship with the husband was not the product of affection or mutual desire, but of a calculated system designed to maintain absolute control over the family's bloodline. The journals, the letters, and the subtle behaviors he had observed all pointed toward a pattern of coercion that had been perfected over generations. It was not simply a story of unconventional marriage, it was a story of domination, psychological manipulation, and a chilling adherence to tradition that prioritized lineage above humanity. The mother had crafted an environment in which everyone's actions, thoughts, and even emotions were monitored and constrained. The husband's subdued demeanor, the daughter's fearful compliance, and the mother's unyielding presence were all pieces of a carefully maintained puzzle that had taken decades to construct. He realized that the shared husband arrangement was never meant to be romantic or consensual. It was an instrument of control, a mechanism to enforce loyalty and obedience, and a method of perpetuating the family's power over its own members. Every action within the household, from the smallest gestures to the way each person spoke, had been influenced by an invisible hierarchy established long before the traveler arrived. The mother's authority was total, extending into the thoughts and feelings of those around her, shaping not just their behavior but their very sense of self. The husband's compliance was not born of love, it was cultivated through years of subtle intimidation and constant surveillance, reinforced by the daughter's equally constrained role. The family's legacy had been built on these principles, ensuring that no one could challenge the mother's dominance without consequences that were immediate, severe, and often silent. In reading the letters and observing the interactions, the traveler could see the careful orchestration of fear and devotion, and he understood that the family's outward calm belied a storm of psychological tension that ran deep through every member's life. The mountains themselves seemed complicit, as if the isolation provided by the hills had been chosen deliberately to shield this system from the outside world. The environment reinforced the control, providing a natural barrier that kept the family insulated, untouchable, and unobserved except by the few outsiders who dared to venture near. Every whispered warning he had heard from locals now made sense. They weren't afraid of gossip or scandal, they were afraid of what might happen to anyone who strayed too close to a system that had perfected secrecy and obedience. As the traveler pieced together the narrative, the realization became unavoidable. This was not a story of eccentric choices or misunderstood love, but a methodical, almost ritualistic enforcement of power, a chilling testament to how human relationships can be manipulated, twisted, and controlled when fear and tradition outweigh freedom and consent.